Thank you very much for being with us today. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, no, thank you, Guya, for inviting me to speak here today. I am very excited to talk here in ISCT and also here in Lisbon. So it's a great pleasure to be here. As Guya was mentioning, my book, Social Movements That Care, Empathy, Solidarity, and Empowerment in the Fight Against Evictions, was published less than a year ago with Palgrave. And basically, okay, does this work? I know I need to.
Is that moving?
Yes. Okay, and so this is the outcome of a long research that I did for my PhD on the platform of those affected by mortgages in English, Plataforma Afectados por la Hipoteca in Spanish, which at the time was the largest social movement organization in the country. So this organization appeared or was created in 2007 in order to tackle the consequences of the global crisis of neoliberalism, and particularly in the housing sector, and the burst of the housing bubble. So it tried to organize people who had mortgages at the time, and then after the crisis erupted, they couldn't pay them back, so they started facing evictions, and also lots of other problems that I will speak about later. And the organization, at the time I was working on the book, was present in 254 locations across Spain. They managed to block thousands of evictions through civil disobedience, and also many more through negotiations with banks. And also they managed to rehouse more than 2,500 people in squatted buildings, generally those that were of the ownership of the person who was evicted, right? So basically like recuperating the housing that was taken over by the financial sector. And also, among other things, they managed to gather the largest official petition in the history of Spain, still to this date, with 1.5 million signatures. They also managed to make changes to one national law that happened recently in collaboration with other housing organizations, such as the renters unions, and also in 5 regional housing laws. And then also as part of this impact that they had very key institutions that, or like some of its members managed to obtain key institutional representation, being the most iconic example, Ada Colau, who was the mayor of Barcelona for 8 years, not anymore, and also Irene Montero, who's used to be the Minister for Equal Opportunities of the previous Spanish government. And then starting to study the presentation and to put you also a bit into context, right? We should be aware that an eviction is more than loses one home, right? Like an eviction is the outcome of a long process of financial, legislative, and also state oppression that a person faces, right? So, you know, as like one of my interviews said, she was saying, you know, an eviction is not that you are kicked out one day. An eviction is a series of events that put you down every day. It is that you can't afford to buy new shoes when yours are broken. It is that you just have enough to eat. It is that the guy from the bank is calling you all the time. It is thinking about what will happen when they will expel you. Where will you go? I don't get help from the administration because they say that they have no social housing left. What can I do, right? So I think that this is a very clear example of what an eviction really means, right? So like eviction, the end point of an eviction is the moment in which you're expelled from your home, but it is a long process in which you're faced with numerous threats from financial institutions, but also public services. It is the constant feeling of insecurity. It is not knowing what will happen to your life. And this has very important problems for the person, right? It means psycho-emotional problems, right? Like depression, anxiety. Also, like there are studies that they link increased likelihood of committing suicide to evictions, right? Both on the personal level, but also like when they study different neighbors and they like suicide rates and evictions, they correlate strongly. It is also problems of identity and challenges of identity that you have to face, right? Because you're constantly reminded that you're unable to achieve some of the most basic things for life, and also that like social expectation, which is like having a home of your own. And also it comes with problems of, like social problems. You cut ties with your friends and families because many times you're not comfortable speaking about your situation. You don't want to share that you're like facing financial problems. You don't want to share that you're going to be kicked out of your home. You have no money, so it's very difficult socially with your friends because a lot of our social interactions depend on money, and you might not even want to talk to them about this. So you're trying to hide this very important problem for you from all your social circles, and then you end up being isolated. But it also has problems of time, right? Because like as you're facing eviction and you're unable to pay your mortgage because like you lost your job, you have to find ways of making a living, right? So like you then have to like be moving from one gig to another. You have to go through this kind of like administrative gincana in which you need to like show to the public services that you're public and social services that you're like in need and you need support, right? So like it's a lot of time that is taken away from you in this relation. So like as I was saying, like to an eviction, there's so much more surrounding an eviction than just the fact of losing one's home. And then the question of my book was, okay, how do we move, right? Like we're like from this situation I was speaking to you about, right? Like facing financial distress, very important psycho-emotional problems, identity issues, social challenges, like not having no time, to being able to build one of the most important movements in Spanish history. And this, I think that like this issue also comes from our perspective, and like now I'm moving to social movement theory, in which like how do we in groups react to grievances, right? So most of social movement research focus on what is called in-group solidarity, right? So it's people who share the same grievance, and because they share this grievance fosters solidarity among them, right? And then they decide to start organizing to defend their rights, right? But the origins of this mobilization comes from these other two types of grievances, right? Which is that sometimes we should realize that a grievance is so overwhelming that it does not foster solidarity, it does not mobilize people, but it hinders solidarity and immobilizes people, right? And then also there are other mobilizations which generally they're associated with mobilizations in support of refugees and so on, right? Which is, and people on the move, which is grievances that foster solidarity with another collective, right? So like as a privileged person, I'm not experiencing that grievance. Realize about the grievance of the other group, and I decide to start organizing in their support. And the point of my book is that these two types of grievances are connected, right? And in order to understand how they come, we should complement conventional social movement theories that they focus very much on this self-interested mobilization, and looking at the politics of care, right? So like the politics of care and care theory, it's there's a long tradition of feminist research on that and feminist theorizing about that. The latest interactions is like two very important books from John Tronto, who describes care as a species activity that includes everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world, so that we can live in it as well as possible, right? And that world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment. And this is very much, and then also what Tronto says, like when she studies the process of care, is that care begins with empathy, right? And as Tronto develops this theory of caring, right, like in relation to general care, I try also to in the book to bring it to social movement studies and to understand mobilization. So what Tronto says is that the process of care has 4 steps, right? What she calls caring about, right? So it's recognizing that there is a need for care, right? So there is a collective that is in the need of care, and then there is another process, like the next step, which is caring for, right? So once we recognize the need of this collective, we assume responsibility for addressing that need, even if it doesn't affect us, right? Or it might affect us, but we assume this responsibility for addressing that need. Then there is the moment in which care is given, right? Like in the moment that privileged outsiders and affected communities connect. There is a process of caring, which I will explain extensively how this works in social movements. And then also there needs to be a moment in which there is what Toronto calls care receiving. So there's a response from the person who received the care, right? So care, and this is very important, care, if we want to understand it from socio-political perspective and particularly social movements, right? It shouldn't just be conceptualized as a mental concern for others, but it needs to translate into certain action. And then based on this theorizing from Toronto, and based on approaches for the political process theory, and also later interactions, such as the theorizing from Austin Troy Fitzpatrick, I developed this process of mobilization of social movements that is based on care. And what I say is that, okay, there's a moment of attentiveness, that this is the part in which Toronto calls caring about, right? Then once this privileged collective realizes that there is this need of care, there is a moment of attribution of threat and opportunity, right? There is a reflection about what is the situation, what can be done about it, and what are the implications of engaging into the mobilization. After this process of attribution of threat and opportunity, there is the moment of responsibility, right? So like this caring for that Toronto speaks about, that is, okay, we're going to start organizing in order to defend the rights of this other collective. And once the decision of starting to organize appears, there is an appropriation of resources, right? We start mobilizing, like the group starts mobilizing networks, seeing what is possible to do. And then once this appropriation of resources is in place, there is the moment in which the privileged group starts organizing, right? So they start like seeking to start mobilization and seeing what to do. During this early moment of mobilization, there are two like outcomes that can come. There's the moment of caregiving, and then two things can happen, right? The privileged group can realize that care has not been successful because of their strategizing has not been successful, right? And like they did not anticipate problems, and then the whole process of care starts again. Or there can be a process of care receiving, which can also translate into further mobilizations, because through the process of care, as we will speak later, comes empowerment of the affected community. With empowerment of the affected community, they're more and more able to do more things, and new strategies, new tactics, and new process of mobilization may begin. So now when we focus on the platform of those affected by mortgages, the first process of attentiveness and caring about, right? So the founders of the platform of those affected by mortgages, those that created it, which are those that appear in this picture, previous picture, none of them had a mortgage in when they decided to start organizing, right? And then the question comes, okay, where did their empathy originate? And for some of them, right, they were part of previous activist circles. Ada Colau and Adrià Alemany were leaders of previous mobilizations called V de Vivienda, which was a mobilization during the housing bubble, trying to defend the rights of young people and other communities to access housing, and criticizing these problems for accessing housing. And also other members of the group of founders were part of Ateneo Candela, which was a social center in the city of Terrassa, which was doing one initiative that was particularly was one initiative that they organized, which were the offices for social rights, in which there were spaces for self support and collective support for people who are living in precariousness, right? And it was people who were living in the country without, like the proper paperwork done, or people who are having problems in relation to other things, and then also issues of housing. And through these previous experiences, they realized that a group that was previously quite badly seen in the activist circles, such as those that wanted to buy houses, right? Because it was seen that they were contributing to the housing bubble, and they were entering into this logic of capitalist logic in relation to housing. They realized that there were people also who were in need of support and were having very strong problems. Then for other members of the founding group, it was also their personal networks. Basically, like they were working with one of these other people I was speaking about, and then after like sharing, they were actually researchers, but on biology. And then like when in the lab they were sharing like these issues, and Ernest was telling them about what he was doing also outside of his work. They also decided it was an important thing to care about, right? So as you say, like empathy can come from many different sources. Then there is the process of caring for or responsibility, right? So like when this group decides that, okay, this is something important that we should start organizing around, they decide to organize the first assembly, which is in a social center in Barcelona, which is called Espai Madalena. And they started just like, like hanging posters, like pasting posters around the city, distributing leaflets and so on. And their first assembly was a huge success. So like there were more than 100 people affected by mortgages, and they were very motivated about this issue. And then they started organizing weekly assemblies. And as they saw that the attendance to the assembly was very consistent, people were starting to participate and so on, they decided to start the first demonstration. And the first demonstration was a huge failure. And by the accounts that they were telling me, they were like, like not expecting like a huge thing, but they were expecting like some people. And what they realized that there were only like 20 people or so. Most of them were friends of them, and like other activists that they did not have housing problems. And there is this kind of like very iconic example that they were telling me that they felt so ashamed to cut the street being such a few people that they decided to do the demonstration on the sidewalk. Right. So this is the level of failure that they felt. Right. And they started to feel very frustrated because they said, okay, we have a lot of people coming to the assemblies. They have a very big problem. Why aren't they coming to this demonstration, which is very important for them? And what they realized is that people affected by mortgages had certain needs, right, that they needed to be attended and they needed to be addressed before they were able to mobilize publicly in this relation, right? So they had a lot of, they were ashamed of admitting that they had problems with their mortgages. They were scared that maybe their friends and their family would see them in the demonstration because they didn't want them to know. They did not identify as activists, and they didn't think that, like activism was an appropriate political channel to address their needs. And also many of them, it was their first experience, so they didn't even know how they would be able to behave in a demonstration. And then they realized, right, that they needed to address all these needs before they were able to organize more contentious activities than just assemblies that were open to the public, but in a rather private space that like nobody would see you outside of that space, right? And then, as I will show, like through these processes, then once this process of care, which I'm going to speak about in a second, took place, that's when the platform started to kick off, and people started to be able to organize around that. And then the process of care receiving, and this is a very important point, is like what is important is that when people are cared for, then they're empowered, right? And empowerment is, like as defined by Wallerstein, it's a social action process that promotes participation of people, organizations, and communities towards the goals of increased individual and community control, political efficacy, improved quality of community life, and social justice. And this is important. And this happens not only in activism, but it happens in every situation, right? Like among our groups of friends, like, we have a problem and we're cared for, we're also empowered. If we think about this more traditional notion of care within the household and the family, right? Like, like kids, babies, and so on, there's this very long process of care that also empowers us, because give us the skills to participate in communal life and to continue with our lives, right? So like, and this is the same in activist circles, in which like when care takes place, people build the skills, they start feeling better, and they are better able to contribute to the community. And what I theorize is that in activist circles and in social movements, we have three types of care. We have emotional care, we have identity care, and we have participatory care. emotional care refers to addressing demobilizing emotions experienced by members and trying to exchange them for mobilizing emotions. How does that happen? How did that happen within the platform of those affected by mortgages? For example, during every assembly, right? This changes from location to location. In Barcelona, which is where I did most of my fieldwork, they have two assemblies. They have what is called the welcome assembly, right? And then they have an in which like that's where they welcome new people. They speak about the cases of different people and so on and how to address them. And then they have the coordination assembly in which they speak about more kind of like organizational issues of the organization. In the welcome assembly, every assembly is started by explaining what the financial crisis was, right? But seeking to have a different emotional framing of the financial crisis. So they were saying instead of taking these neoliberal discourses of financial guilt, approaching people as people who did not want to pay, but they should pay, and so on, and blaming the individuals for the issue of the crisis and for the crisis itself, they provided a more structural logic of the crisis, right? They spoke about how greedy banks were, about how they were behaved, how banks were bailed out and families were not bailed out, and how even though those banks were bailed out and they had received the support from institutions, they were still being so greedy that they were kicking people out of their homes, right? Then also they presented defaulting, getting a mortgage and defaulting on a mortgage as a common sense issue, right? So like mortgages, because like you would get a mortgage because like surprise, surprise, like maybe like it has some resonation for today's time. Rents were crazily expensive and it was impossible also to have a rent. So people were getting indebted to get housing, but also defaulting on the mortgage was a common sense issue because people were faced when they had financial distress between, as it was framed in the organization, feeding their families and paying for the mortgage. And of course, when you have to take this decision, you prioritize giving money to giving food and shelter to your kids rather than paying a financial institution. As I was saying, also, instead of being like the fault of the families, it was banks and financial institutions who were presented with this framing as irresponsible and risk prone, right? So they did not do their due diligence in doing the research because they were greedy. They wanted to give mortgages also to people who might not be able to pay in the future, but because they knew that they would not bear the responsibility of that. Because like if like the person wouldn't pay, it was the person who would lose their home and not the bank, right? Then, as I was saying, they were speaking about the bank bailout. So like all these banks, they're being supported by state institutions, but not families. And then this issue in which I spoke about paying the mortgage and feeding the family, right? So through this framing, guilt is moved away from the individual towards the structural and financial institutions. And this reproduces also feelings of solidarity because people see that there are many more people in their situation, and anger against these institutions who were doing all these things against them. When it comes to identity care, right, I differentiate between self-identity and collective identity, right? Self-identity means how do we perceive ourselves as individuals? Collective identity is how do we perceive the group that we're part of? In relation to self-identity, as I was saying, like, like defaulting on mortgage like produces feelings or like identities of like dispossession, identities of like being sort of a loser, not being able to achieve your like the things that you want. And this reproduces an identity of what is called in the sociological literature learned helplessness, right? As we are being constantly unable to achieve the things that we want, we incorporate that we're unable to achieve anything. And what is very important from the perspective of the organization is what they call these tiny great victories, right? So every small victory that was achieved in the organization was hugely celebrated. And this could be like even, like taking a document, asking the bank for something, and the bank clerk telling you, no, I don't want the document, but at least you were able to go to the bank office and face them for the first time. And this changes the things, and it's hugely celebrated in the assembly. People would start clapping, hugging each other, like for these tiny things. And this logic behind tiny great victories is that no victory is small enough if it's important for someone. And if this victory is important for someone, then it's important for the collective. And through this process of tiny great victories that become bigger and bigger also, right? Because like once you start in the process of facing the banks and trying to solve your problems, you're better able to achieve certain things. Individuals change their identity from being a defaulter, which is an identity related to something that you did not do, right? You're a defaulter because you did not pay, to being an affected activist, right? Which is an identity that is mobilizing because it connects you to something that you do, activist, right? Like activity. Also, in relation to collective identity, something that is very common, and you've seen it through the PPT that I was showing here, are these green T-shirts from the organization, right? These are hugely recognized in Spain. Like every activist takes them when they go to negotiate with banks, when they go to social services to negotiate with them, also when they go to the protest. And many of these activists, when I was speaking to them about these T-shirts, they refer to the T-shirts as a shield, as something that protected them, right? Because people knew that they were part of the organization, that they were not alone anymore. And this changed already how bank clerks were treating them, how they were relating to them. And I can tell you also one like anecdote from my time there, right? About how like this makes you feel like really good of being part of this collective. One morning I was on my way to an eviction blockade organized by the organization, right? And I was wearing also this green T-shirt, and I was like running a bit early, right? So I decided to stop to get a coffee in a coffee shop, and I request the coffee. I say, thank you, I wanted to pay. And then the bartender tells me, no, you shouldn't pay because you guys are doing such a great thing that you should not be allowed to pay. Can you imagine like what's the difference? Like this tiny example, right? For somebody who has been mistreated like such a long time and telling them that they serve for nothing, they should pay, they're unable to pay, and feeling that they are recognized for that. And this is an amazing feeling. So they start also identifying with the organization as something huge and something they're part of that is much more kind of like bigger and beautiful than what like people were telling them that they were and the groups that they were part of. And also something very important for this collective identity is this constant reference in the organization from, in Spanish is called hoy por ti, mañana por mí, which means today for you, tomorrow for me. In English, I would translate it as you scratch my back and I will scratch yours, right? Which means today we help you, but we help you not because we like you very much or because you are who you are, right? Which is also true, but we help you because you're part of the organization. And then later you're going to help us because that's how we build collective power. And that's how we win these things and how we're not alone in this situation. And there is a constant reference to that creates this change from being interested in solving just one's problem, that is the situation that most people arrive with to the organization and the intention, to being to wanting to help other people in the organization, other friends, and then to a later step that is to defend the right to housing, even for those who did not make it to the organization, which is the logic behind the legislative changes from PA. Then finishing with the last type of care is what I call participatory care, right? Which is the process in which activists and newcomers build skills and are better able to contribute to their goal, so solving their housing problem, but also to the goal of the collective. And this happens in many ways, but I'd like to highlight two of those today, which is a setting that they do in every action in the organization, which is called, like they say, one learns and another, like one does and another learns, right? So like when they organize any action, such as an eviction blockade or a protest at a bank or anything, before organizing those actions, there is a distribution of roles, right? So in this distribution of roles, there is somebody who is able to, who says, okay, you're the one who's gonna, you're the group who's...
To reopen Zoom because it's stopped, sorry.
Oh, okay, so I'll
Or is ongoing? Oh, it's ongoing.
Oh, it's ongoing.
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, it's still.
Can people on Zoom confirm that they can see us or hear us?
Because of my.
Yes, we can.
Great,
But now,
thank you.
about now the PowerPoint is,
Sorry
you
to
stopped
interrupt.
sharing it, no?
Yeah.
Because yeah. Perfect.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry. Is it mine?
So as I was saying, in every action before the action takes place, there is a planning phase in which there is a distribution of roles, right? So like for an eviction blockade, let's say there's a group of people who are going to stand in the entrance of the building. So the police and the judicial entourage are not able to enter the building. There's a group of people who are going to go and negotiate with the judicial entourage. And there's a group of people who are going to go upstairs to the apartment of the person. So those people that are facing the eviction are not alone and are also emotionally supported, right? So in addition to all these roles that are about doing, there is also a role of people who will go and learn, right? So like basically it means that like you'll go, for example, with the person who's in charge of negotiating with a judicial entourage, and you'll just see how they negotiate. And this is very important because first, like some of the things that you learn about negotiations, you see them in practice. And this is very different. It's very different to know, okay, if they answer you this, you should answer that, or like that's how you should approach this. And being in the middle of this huge confrontation, very heated, in which like you have to experience those emotions, right? So then there are all these situations in which you're exposed to what you hopefully be able to do in the future for the organization in a way that is more comfortable for you because you don't have to do it, but still you start experiencing those emotions. And something that I think is also key in this process of learning is that generally after each eviction blockade, there is a moment in which like when it's successful, people will go and have a coffee. Right. And this moment, this moment of like being in a terrace, having a coffee together, I think is key and very important for learning because there is obviously a discussion about what was going on. Right. And the kind of learning that happens there is much more informal. Right. Because it's like, wow, I really like how you said this to the police and how they reacted to that. This you realize how this really worked well. Wow, you really did a great job when you like didn't let them pass in this way or when you did that. Right. And this kind of like socializing through a very informal way of a coffee is a very important way of learning also the different skills in the organization, and not only for the person who was watching the person doing, but for many other people who are part of this group, right? And then also other types of participatory care, which are more traditional, are workshops, right? So like organizing workshops in order to learn different details, right? And the workshops, they can go from details about a law to like the practical ways of entering into a building, right? So like there's this huge variability of workshops, and like also like maybe using Twitter, but it goes from very low risk, very conventional, easy actions to actually learning how to like open a key lock and like being able to enter into a building. And also something important for these workshops is not only about learning during the workshops, but many times during the workshops there is expectation that then you'll go to your local chapter and you organize workshops yourself, right? So there is a national workshop that takes place somewhere in Spain, right? Like you go, let's say, to Seville for the workshop, and then those who are part of the workshop, they're going to learn also how to become trainers so they can go back to Coruña, Granada, Madrid, Barcelona, and organize workshops themselves as well. Which this means that there is a expansion of the knowledge, which is facilitated by this situation, but also there is the empowerment of those people because they pass from being learners to achieving another a role in the organization, which is closer to like what you would call a leadership role, right? Because you're teaching people how to do other things. And this kind of like process of empowerment in which you learn to do things and you're able to do new things, which are more complex, is key for two things in the organization. First, because, well, for three things. First, because it helps like people like do more complex things. Second, because it helps to avoid burnout, because there are more experienced activists that they do not have to take care of those roles because there are other people who are able to do that. So like delegation is very important in the case of burnout, and that's also something that is very helpful. And then the third thing is because it leaves a space for newcomers and new people to join also those low complexity, low confrontation activities, right? That they need to do because there are other people that are doing those activities. And that's very important for the first step into activism, right? Which can be taking the notes for the first assembly, helping to clean the assembly space, designing the posters and the banners for the demonstration, right? Which are things that everyone has done in the past, right? Everyone has drawn something, everyone has cleaned something, but that's the first time for many people that they do it in activism. So that's the first step into activism and the first contribution to the group, which is very important. So just closing the presentation, as I was saying, I think that like from the book and from this talk, I think that like a very important takeaway is that there are different types of grievances, that they have different effects on individuals, and that they lead to different processes of mobilization, right? So like self-interested grievances have their own process of mobilization. Solidarity grievances, they have another process of mobilization. Also that these coalitions between conscious early risers, right, these privileged outsiders, and immobilized beneficiary constituents, they can lead to very important mobilizations. And as we see inequality grow, and like also grievances and problems of people on the move becoming more and more important, I would expect that these types of mobilization will become more and more important. But with these mobilizations comes also the challenge of when should privileged outsiders step down, right? So like, because then when is the moment to, like let the group that is affected by a grievance speak for itself and speak by itself, and not having always a privileged outsider that is representing them or organizing them or kind of like telling them what to do. And this is a very difficult challenge because obviously activism is very motivating for people. It has a lot of social rewards, and that means that like then it's very difficult to step down because people, like privileged people who are like doing it, also want to contribute, experiencing those emotions. But it's important to have that reflection. And then also, I think a very important takeaway from today is that care is not only important for movements and organizations that are based on this kind of like immobilizing affected individuals and privileged outsiders, but they're key for any mobilization, right? Also mobilizations and organizations of self-interested individuals, they care for each other. They develop these kinds of cares that I was speaking about. So this is not only about this more unequal kind of mobilizations, but sustained and inclusive mobilization requires care and empowerment practices in every group and organization. So thank you very much. I hope that I was not too long, and yeah, happy to have any questions.
Close to you, just to see what's happening there.
Yeah.
No, it wasn't too long at all. The goal of this seminar is exactly to have the time to present our works without this kind of short limits in other kind of conferences, seminars, and workshops, and also to leave. Tell me. To leave room for discussion. Sorry. To leave room for discussion, so if there is some, thank you very much. It was very interesting, the presentation, and for sure there are comments, questions, and here in the physical room or in the virtual room. So Hara, she just say, I'm teaching in 10 minutes. I have to leave. Thank you, Philip, and congratulations for organizing this. So Hara, she's leaving.
Thanks for coming, Hara.
So this was her comment. So there is someone else, someone that want to ask something. Okay, yeah.
So Philip, thank you for your presentation and for being here today. I have two questions, and I had the opportunity to read some parts of your book last week. I took advantage of the fact that you uploaded it to ResearchGate. Yes, I'm very thankful for. And one thing that your book makes very clear is how care sustains participation, how it helps people overcome feelings of shame and exhaustion, the immobilizing grievances, right? And so that made me think about movement longevity and the life cycle of social movements, why some movements fade quickly and others can last years or even decades. So my first question is, do you think that the presence of strong care practices within a social movement can explain why some movements endure over time, even under difficult conditions? And my second question has to do with, as you illustrated, the platform of those affected by mortgages didn't start with at the beginning with those mostly directly with those that were most directly affected, but with outsiders that you call in your book solidarity early risers. And this highlights the role of care in initiating mobilization, even when those most affected are too overwhelmed to act. But at the same time, there is a thin line between what is politicized care and a type of care that slips into charity, which can be disempowering. So my question is, how can movements manage that balance? And how do they make sure that care remains empowering and politicizing rather than turning into a form of assistance that risks reproducing dependency?
Okay, well, yeah.
Maybe we could let me see if there are more questions. I have some few comments, and maybe there will be more comments and questions rising from the discussion. And I think, well, I really like your work. I really appreciate your work. You
Thank
already
you.
know, and we already had previous discussion conversations and exchange about this topic. Even if I think I never heard you really talking about this specific research, I heard you talking about many other issues, and that you also there are also part of your research, and I haven't had read the book yet, but I really like this approach, and is very similar to something. So some of the concerns are also you also address many of the concerns that I also have in my own work. I think that you I don't know if you in theoretical terms and dialoguing with social movement studies, to which extent you dialogue with the studies on social movement consequences, and because I feel that you have a great opportunity to really redefine which are the consequences of social movements. So really like kind of thing that is really an area where things are not moving so much, theoretically speaking. I think that one big progress was the book by Jim Jasper, Gains and Losses, which is I think is a very also important for your approach. So this idea of very small gains, small losses also, not just gains that are contributing to also the redefining the identities, and so to look at consequences in these terms. And also I was thinking and listening to you about the this some older aspect of mobilization processes since the early stages of the worker movement, about mutualism and all these kind of things that I think are very important. That now we talk a lot about prefigurative politics and social direct action, etc., but forgetting that there were experiences at the beginning of work of the social movements in when there were strikes, etc. There were any kind of forms of mutualism to support people that were striking, and I think this is also very interesting. And after another thing I wanted to ask you, when you were mentioning about the coffee, that the guys that were offering the coffee, and also about these discussions that emerge in this situation, how the narrative about what's happening is carried out. And this is very interesting also from the linguistic point of view, and how you can really kind of reframe the narrative about the success. It's not just a success in itself, but it's also what you transmit as a success. And also I was asking now if what's happening around. So this is internal of the movement and the participant, but for sure there are also people that are around, no? Like for the people that are also in the bar, or if there is some kind of resonance around the group. So not just in the people internal to the group. And this is my question. If there isn't anything else, Tiago.
Thank you, Felipe, for this, for the great weekend as well.
Yeah.
Pleasure to have you here in Convent as well. So I was listening to you, and I haven't read the book, but I read the thesis a long time ago. So, and one of the things that I was thinking as I was listening to you was, how well do you think this travels? You know, not only in terms of in how you define the cases, and you can define case studies in different ways. It can be a country, or it can be a social movement, a specific social movement. And I was thinking both, actually. Is there anything that is specific to PA and to Spain that leads to this, right? You know, one argument that I make is that political culture and the social networks that existed before the crisis in Spain were very different from the ones in Portugal, right? And also the presence of political parties among us. social movements, as Cristina Flecha-Fubinari also shows. And so I was thinking that, and I was thinking, given our fieldwork incursion on Friday night, right, for the evening, I was thinking did you see anything that was similar or different from the way that, of course, it was just a few hours, right, and there was a very specific environment in the social center, but I was thinking if you saw anything that contrasts with what you saw in Spain.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking also in terms of trade unions. Trade unions wouldn't do this kind of work, I think.
I think your
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the questions and comments. I'll go in order. I'll try. So the first question that you were saying about like sustained mobilization and mobilization in more difficult times as well, right? I think that how more quantitative people would say, right? Like care is a necessary but not sufficient condition for sustained mobilization, which means that I think that if there's no care, there won't be mobilization organization for a very long time, because as Tronto says, care is the basis of life, because we are interdependent individuals, and in the moment that there's interdependence, there's care in any setting, right? So as I said, like this is something very like focused on movements, but then like a lot of the work on care from previous feminist scholars is more related to like Toronto, how we organize society, but also care within the family, and also reminding us not to idealize care, because care comes also with a lot of negative implications, especially like all the work that they speak about, like, you know, like care in the family, how care is unevenly distributed between men and women, how care also comes with many times with feelings of obligation, of guilt, and so on. But I think that, as I was saying, going back to your question, I think it's something that is central to mobilization, but then there are many other things that explain why some movements fail or succeed, or like why they're able to live for longer time spans or less. Also, we should not forget, and like the work from Gomer is very important for that like many times mobilizations do not die, but they kind of like go through abeyance structures. They are less present in mobilizations, and then at other moments they come back to the peak. And like during these moments in which mobilizations are not very visible, there's still a lot that goes on that facilitates these later mobilizations. So in that regard, I think that it's very important, but it's not the only explanation. So like even also if an organization, their members are great at caring for each other, and they have this great thing, you know, there might be other factors that explain why like the mobilization fails, right? Like very heavy repression, or maybe they like achieve their objective and they move on, or they become co-opted by institutions. In relation to what you said about what's like about this tension between caring and organizing for others, and you know, becoming what's called in the literature like humanitarianism, right? This is something that they reflect a lot about, particularly in researchers who study movements in solidarity with people on the move, right? Because that's also very common, and like and you're right, there is a very thin line. What I say in the book is that one of the components of, or like the ways of like deciding on which side like this is empowerment, right? If there's a vocation of empowerment of the affected community, of being able to build a strength in the affected community so they can speak by themselves, so they can organize by themselves, I think that's something key in order like to divide this line between more contentious activities and humanitarianism, which is not always easy, because like many times also like there might be, as I was like saying in the conclusion, there might be a vocation of empowerment, and you try to like do all those things, but then privileged outsiders, they don't want to step down, and that's also a very important challenge. So like outsiders need to be ready to step down, and there needs to be a vocation of empowerment. Then your comments, Guya, on first, like Jasper is super central to my work. Not only his gains and losses, but like, like emotions, this interaction, this perspective in which like you're also a very important author. That's key for the work, and you're right. Also this, like what you said about these small gains and losses, that's why I like so much the paper that you, Antio, presented in Iceland, that was on these like non-events, what you were calling at the time, because that's precisely it, right? Like those are the things that really kind of like make something succeed, and like they're like is where these small gains happen, and when there is this kind of like these openings to the possibility of something bigger possibly happening. So I think they're very, very, very important. And also, like, I think like there you were having also a conversation, like what you were saying, that like this is something that's present in, like, has been present forever, right? And you were speaking about mutualism in trade unions and so on. I think that, for example, like, how do you call it? Like, it's like in English, in Spanish, they're called resistance boxes. So basically, like, like when there is a strike, people putting money in a box, like for those who are striking, to be able, that's a perfect example of care, right? Because like that's a way of assuring that the needs of those who are mobilizing are met, right? And that, because also a very important part of care in social movements is protecting members of the organization from the perils of activism, right? So like,
because now that you are saying, but this is also interesting because I think it's not just, it's also at the same time a form of prefigurative politics, because in a certain way, okay, you are doing something to help, and it's also kind of such a direct action. So to help in the specific situation, it has a concrete consequences. But for instance, like in the case of mutualism, in the context of the strikes, the things were really shared and etc. It also, like in your case, is also a model of the society that people, the activists would like to have in the future. So it also has a meaning, a message in itself, the type of help. Sorry to interrupt you. I was just thinking about.
You're right. I didn't think so much about that from that perspective, but I think that like you're spot on with that, because there's a prefiguration of how society should look like, and moving away from this individualistic vision of society to a society that is based on interdependence, right? That which is like that's the whole, like the last book from Toronto is all about that. How do we build institutions and societies that they recognize interdependence and not humans as individuals? And I think that like you're spot on with that. Then also what you were saying about these coffees and resonance around the group. I think that happens a lot, because also like the nice thing about the pie is that they have these like t-shirts that are impossible not to see, because it's this very like highly visible green, and like it's being like very widely recognized. And I think that like also when they go around, people like pay more attention to them, right? And it's like it's probable that what you're saying is also happening, right? Like who people are around you, then go and see what's happening. Or there are like examples, for example, of actions in bank offices, right? In which they basically like go and they block the bank office for one day, in which when bystanders see it, they also engage in solidarity with them, right? Like they encourage them and so on, that they say something to the police and so on, right? And I think that also that has a lot to do with these dynamics. In relation to what Tiago was saying about how much this travels, I think there are specificities of the path that make care very, very important for the organization. One of them is, I think, that it is overwhelmingly run by women. And there is something there that speaks also about this identity of men as breadwinners, and how we men process emotions, right, in a much more introspective way, right? That leads, like when they're like families are facing eviction, that they lead more women to go to the assembly, right? So like men remain at home, like being very upset at themselves and so on. And it is like, and that's very clearly in the dynamics of the organization, that those like when like the first time that like a family goes to present their case and to speak about that, it's women generally who speak, right? And then like this consciousness about this care and this socialization into caring, I think that's very, very important. This being said, as I said, I think that care takes place in every organization across countries and cultures, and in all social movements. Then there might be certain movements that they play more emphasis on that, other movements that they play more emphasis on others, that some movements might be very good at certain types of care and others be less good as other types of care. So that might vary, but I think that like this is something like caring in organizations, something that happens in every single organization and in every single country. Because as I said, it's like it's necessary for mobilization, right? So like if there's no caring among activists, nothing's going to happen. And the only organizations that they can function without care are organizations in which there's money involved, right? So like companies, organizations, right? You might not be cared for, and like, you know, like colleagues might not care for you. But you like those organizations keep going because there's a monetary incentives that like, you know, like connects you to them, right? And maybe that's also why they're like workspaces are less caring spaces that other social spaces in which there's no money involved.
I think that Bruno's asked.
Okay, and then just one
Of
comment on
course.
what you were saying also, like this or like organization. I think that like in when we were confronting on Friday in the social center, I like very much what like this thing that we're having all around that is like na luta con rabia también con placer, or na luta con rabia con placer. I think that that's also very important, right? So like allowing people to enjoy activism, right? Because activism it's full of bad experiences and suffering, right? Because like that's why people end up in activists, right? Because like there is a problem, there is always like a constant solution. There's a lot of precariousness, right? Like, you know, like a majority of people who are like in activism, people who come from lower class backgrounds and so on. So like poverty comes with its own problems, and being able to give people small space for some time to celebrate, to feel good about themselves, and to like be outside of like, you know, like their miseries and all these sufferings of activism. I think it's very, very important for the sustaining of an organization.
Bruno.
Hello, Felipe. Hello, Guia. I'm from Brazil, Felipe, and
You hear from home? From here?
I liked too much your presentation. What do you think about the women participation in this kind of strategy? Because it's more common here in Brazil, the great participation of women in the social movement in a territory. What do you think about the gender issue in care in the social movement in Spain in your and where you make you do you did the research in during your research?
Yes. Thank you, Bruno, and thank you for connecting from so far and quite early for you, I would imagine. So I think that that's very important because also, as I said, like I think like a very important explanation of care was why care was so important in the PA was the fact that like many women run the organization, not only on the very visible kind of ranks, but also on the less visible ones. But also, as I was also mentioning, we should not idealize care, right? Because also like that comes with a lot of responsibilities, and that comes like caring activities in an organization are generally less visible, which means that are more likely to be taken on by women, right? So like men are more likely, and there are studies about that as well. They're more likely to take more visible roles in an organization, like spokesperson, like negotiating, like, you know, like taking like more kind of like speaking space in the assembly, and women are less likely to do so. So there should be also some conscious about that, right? Because as I was saying, like some of the very important steps in the organization for people to enter into this process of empowerment, which is very easily accessible activities for them, have to do with cleaning the assembly space, with designing banners for demonstrations, with taking notes, right? Which are activities that are like not very visible, and they're more likely to be performed by women. So I think that's something very good that like the PA was doing on that, right? It's like, or at least attempting to do. So they were encouraging everyone to do that, right? So like during the coordination assembly, like, you know, like there has to be decided, there had to be a commitment from somebody who would clean the space, the assembly space for like before the next week, right? And they were also encouraging like not only women but men to doing that. And like there is like a very important, like the person who's chairing the assembly has a very important role, because has to be conscious about that and juggle this, like, okay, being able to see who are some of the newcomers who might not be comfortable doing other things, but they might say, okay, I can do and clean this, and also like encouraging them to do that and not reproducing this kind of gendered patterns of activism. So I think it's key, and as I said, like there's a very difficult balance to be struck in being conscious that care is very important and like how it's key for activism, but also not idealizing it, because it also reproduces certain kind of oppressions that take place in society at large, and also in activism.
Mhm. There is some more comments, some more questions. You would like to say something else? Yeah. What's the connection? Is more curiosity. What's the connection? Of this your work is very different. You also use quantitative methods for others, so it's really kind of polarized in this sense. And you also study polarization, by the way. So, and so it's curious how you manage to have this kind of approach. It is not just qualitative; it's more than qualitative. It's really kind of a framework, analytical framework, and the concerns you have here, they're very specific and very what we were listening, and I think is clear, and the other interests of your work that are. So this is just a curiosity. I think it maybe can also be interesting for my student one day when I show this video to them.
I think that that has a lot to do with my methods training and the influence from two people that I learned methods from, which is Levente Litvai, which is a very kind of important student of populism and also of quantitative methods. He has written several of these like sage little green books, they call them, which are these very like good methods books. Like I'm very advanced thing. Like I think like one of his books is on nested analysis in structural equation modeling, so like super complex. And also Erin Jenny, who's also she's an international relations scholar. She studies like a big part of her studies on nationalist movements, but also on populism. And both of them emphasize very much. And Erin is a mixed method scholar, right? So she has done a lot of quantitative stuff, but also a lot of qualitative stuff. And they emphasize very much, and I agree with them, that there's not right or wrong method, right? There are methods who are able to answer certain questions and methods who are able to answer other questions. And I think that's the way to take that forward, right? And also always being honest about the logic of, and this is like positivist language, but the logic of causality that is behind each method, right? Because quantitative methods are based on a logic of repetition, right? If something happens like in a specific amount of times, then we consider it that it's significant, right? That it's true, that it's real and it's happening. But that doesn't mean that it will happen every single time, right? Because it's based on repetition and there's not always repetition. So you should not take a conclusion that you have based on quantitative research to a very specific case, and this has to be like that. And then qualitative methods are based on a processual logic of causality, right? So it's like being able to connect one thing with the other with a very hard work, like very nuanced work with this, with that. But then it means that maybe it does not apply to every single case. So we should not be too confident generalizing. That's the one part. The other part is because you need to have a job, and then I got hired in a project that was on surveys, and then now I'm publishing a lot with surveys. And then yeah.
But it's not easy really to manage because is, as I was saying, it's not just being qualitative, but it's a specific way of approaching the object, and it's also kind of you situate yourself in the context, and so this is not just to use one method or another, because it's very many times declaring that we are doing mixed methods is kind of just more a declaration than a really, and I think that this is you go really in depth in both. And it's very, very precious, I think, well, just to conclude that there is this small, not joke, but a kind of reflection that any times, well, of course, my quantitative methods are almost inexistent, But anytime I present something with qualitative methods or very micro analysis like this one, there is always the question about generalization. And like this situation is unique, you cannot what you can say with this. And my answer is always like, there is this very famous linguistic scholar in United States, Sally Jackson, and she say, when you want to know which are the rules of the chess, you look at two players, what they're doing. You don't know anything about the game. Imagine you don't know anything about the game of chess. You just need to sit and look at them, what they're doing. And after you have infinite games, but the rules are these ones. So the observation and also give you, there is a kind of some mechanism that even not of them, but many of them, they are repeated. If you want to know how many women they do this game and how many men, and you need to have a quantitative method or see if the probability of women doing more this. So I think that this is, but I really appreciate your flexibility and how much you enter in depth in the two paths. So thank you for your. There is some more comment or question or suggestion. So you want to say something else?
I just like say that thank you very much for organizing this. Like thank you for coming and being here, and thank you for your kind words. Like now that you said about my research. So yeah, it was a pleasure.
It was great to have you here. And well, we this section is recorded, and we will put in the YouTube page if you agree.
Yes,
of
yes,
our
of course.
seminar. So well, it will be available there. And thank you very much.
And also, as it was said, like probably the publisher should not know it, but if you need to access the book, it's on research guys.
I didn't want to say that, but we knew. And well, thank you. This is also kind of politics of care for scholars. Exactly. Okay, that's great. Thank you so much. And it was really great to have you here, finally. Thank you all, and see you next time. Ciao, Bruno.
Ciao.